Today I'm talking about a subject that seems stupid in theory, but actually has some merit, and I've actually given it a lot of thought. And that is, does crime actually pay? AKA, does crime actually make you any money? And I'm going to be brutally and completely honest when I talk about this topic, because this is something that I actually would think about when I was younger and first getting into business. Not necessarily because I was interested in doing things like this, but mainly because, there's more of a culture of fast money when you're young and you see people kind of doing things to get money and, are in things that may or may not seem unsavory to you, but it seems like it's going not extremely well, but fairly well for them. So this is something you need to seriously think about and consider. It's not just an open and shut thing like, oh no, I'll never do it, because there's more nuance to topics like this than you would think. So to answer the first question, does crime actually pay? And I'm going to be brutally honest and say, yes, it does. Now, that depends on the type of crime, but also, yes, it does, mainly because it's scalable. So crime, just like business, only pays well at a bigger scale. For the most part, when you're doing small-scale crimes, it doesn't necessarily pay the best. And that might or might not sound stupid, but it's true. So when you're doing a business, if your business isn't scalable, then over time, you're not going to make any more money. You're just going to kind of float around this certain range, and you won't grow and you won't shrink. And that's not usually ideal. When you're talking about crime, let's talk about selling things, right? Let's talk about selling things. If you were, for example, to buy $100 worth of product and sell it for $200, that's a 100% profit margin. You're able to re-up with 150 or the full 200 and keep trying to double it, or even try to go up by 20 to 30% every re-up. And that will work. Are you doing methods, right? Methods. If you're doing methods, you could take the route of popularity to try to reach a much larger and greater audience. If you're able to reach a large and great audience, then, for example, like Punchmade Dev, someone like that, or Babytron, you're able to reach, or TJX6, you're able to reach a lot bigger of a demographic to be able to communicate with and execute your methods or plans or plays, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do better, but you can scale that. That is something that is scalable, and you have the ability to get a bigger audience to be able to profit off of. And that's the same kind of idea in business. Now, I'm going to genuinely talk about the pros and cons between business and not necessarily safe for work. I'm going to say activities. When you're talking about doing illegal things, there's a genuine thought that, okay, somebody, like, you can make more money doing crime and it's faster, but it's not always the case. And today I'm going to talk about the pros and the cons of each. So let's talk about the cons of business and the cons of crime. So regular business, it is oftentimes slower, because if you are able to find and get put on to a method when it comes to crime, when you're able to find and get put onto a method, then you'll be able to make money, not immediately, but pretty quickly. You'll be able to pretty quickly start to generate a profit, because usually it's a lower margin or lower barrier of entry. Like, you don't need to get a college education to sell substances or, do a method per se, but you might need to just put in a little bit of money to be able to start, or just link up with somebody to be able to start. For a business, it's a lot slower. It's not immediate. Usually you need to build an audience. You need to you need to learn a lot. For example, let's talk about a product-based business. You need to learn how to set up a website. And if you don't want to learn any of this, that's BS. You have to learn these things because it's not, after it's set up for you, you still need to learn how to maintain these things. So you need to learn how to set up a website. You need to learn how to do product research. You need to learn marketing to a very high degree. And then you need to be able to know how to manage money to a certain extent to be able to determine what your ROAS is, how profitable you are, and then how much risk you can take on. So you need to learn a lot. That's a pretty high barrier of entry versus kind of learning as you go when doing like crime. And I've never done crime. You know, I mean, I've done things that are not like above board all the time, but crime? No, that's not something that I've ever partaken in. And I know a lot of people who have, and that's the only reason I can even confidently speak on this subject. Another con about business is it's usually more competitive. And I'm not saying more competitive in the sense that like, oh, there's just no one who's there's just no one who's doing crime. That's absolutely not true. But when it comes to crime, I'm not willing to take the risk that comes with crime. I'm not going to be selling. I'm not going to be doing things that come with that activity. I'm not going to take that risk. I will always choose regular and normal business over that specific activity. I'm not going to sell things. I'm not going to do methods. I'm not going to do that. I'm usually going to go and opt for a regular scalable business because I know longer term that works out better, but it's a lot harder to get into. Now, next is it's tedious. And that sounds stupid and redundant because a job is tedious. Yes, that's true. But it doesn't mean that crime is not tedious. Of course it's tedious, but regular business often involves usually boring day-to-day activities. Boring, not just activities, but just boring things. You need to learn accounting more. You need to understand, what a ROAS is. You need to see how your things are performing, how your ads are doing. I'm specifically talking about product-based businesses right now because that's the one that is the most familiar to me. So when you're selling things, you need to be able to understand a little bit more when it comes to just accounting and then ad spend and then just how to run a campaign in general, marketing, and it's kind of boring. It's not the most fun thing to do, quite honestly. It's tedious, it's boring, and there's not a lot of fun activities. You're just not really taking a lot of, physical risk when doing a legitimate business. It's just not something that's normal in a legitimate business, unless you're doing like high stakes construction or something, But that's usually what I mean by it's more tedious. When you're doing crime, it's not as tedious because you're usually making bigger plays more often than not, if you're trying to grow at least. And then for regular business, it's not about making big plays. It's basically just about just being normal, like just doing the bare minimum typically, which is kind of stupid, but it is what it is. That's how business operates. That's what business is. So now let's talk about the cons of crime. It's dangerous. Obviously, it's dangerous. Not just dangerous in the sense that, oh, you might not be able to be safe while doing it. That's not necessarily what makes it dangerous. What makes it dangerous is you could lose your freedom, and that freedom is everything. Also, you could physically get hurt. That is a real cause for concern. Physically getting hurt is something that's not ideal. You don't want to, really do a physical activity that could potentially really be detrimental to your health. You want to live a long time. You want to be able to enjoy the wealth that you accumulate. I mean, I know this sounds maybe stupid to some people, but it's real. It's a real concern. It's a legitimate concern that I would have doing crime. Doing crime just doesn't seem worth the risk half the time to me. So that's one thing, that it's just dangerous. It doesn't feel good. It's just kind of not worth that physical risk to me. If you want to take a more physical approach to business, you can become like an athlete or become a coach, and then you can still take that physical kind of risk to be able to develop and grow your brand. And, you know, like, that is something that's a bit more physical. But crime is dangerous, and people know that. People die all the time doing nothing, but crime obviously enhances that risk. Risk versus reward. And what I'm talking about is long-term reward is lessened because of the risk of your freedom being taken. Let's say you were able to accumulate $1 million in a year. If you get locked up for 25 years and that $1 million is seized, what did you really gain? Sure, you gained material wealth for a very short period of time, but longer term, you're not going to be able to travel. You're not going to be able to have a stable life, a good normal existence. Even getting a job will be so much harder for you than somebody who's not in that situation. So it's just too risky for what you're getting. And what I think you're getting is basically just not enough. You're not getting enough of a promise, enough of a win to justify that huge risk you usually take while doing crime. The last thing is, it's stressful. Crime is extremely stressful. Even regular business is stressful, but crime, you need to think about not just, oh, I might lose money here. You might lose your life. You might lose your freedom. You might lose your family. You might lose your identity. You might lose everything. You will lose a lot more than just money if you partake in criminal activity long enough. Now, the pros of crime is that it's usually fast. The money you get is super quick. The money you get is super, not fun, but it's quick. It's a lot easier to obtain, but it's just harder to do long term. Now, the obvious benefit of both crime and regular business is that it's scalable. But my preference in regular business is more that you get to have a normal life. I don't have the fear of the police. I don't have the fear of anyone who's going to come get me. But I do have a healthy fear of losing money and losing, just monetary things. But monetary things are not permanent. Monetary things money can come and go. But something that can't come and go is like your health and your freedom. Those things are usually priceless to people. And that's what you're risking with doing crime on a regular basis. But regular business is scalable, so is crime. But regular business, longer term, you'll be able to be more rewarded. And also, you'll have a better life in general. Just a more fun, more stable. And that may sound boring, but it's real. It's true. You get to have the life that you dream of without the scary repercussions of actually doing criminal activities. So, that's a real dissection. I can go into specific crimes if people want me to, but that's not what the point of today was. It's just to really understand, does crime pay? And yes, it absolutely does pay, but only because it's scalable. But so is business, and you can do business instead of crime, and business is still scalable. Is it a bit harder? Yes, but I wanted to talk about those key differences. People kind of already knew them, but just in general, crime does pay. Don't let people tell you, oh, crime doesn't pay. It absolutely does. You would not see all these successful people. And there's even people who have legitimate successful businesses that end up turning to criminals. So, for example, Bernie Madoff, one of the biggest Ponzi schemes, or the biggest Ponzi scheme to ever exist. And he was a white-collar criminal. There's plenty of those out here. But that's pretty much it. If you guys want anything else to know about it, I've done sneaker deals, which is kind of close to that. If you guys want to hear about that, let me know. And yeah, thanks for watching.